We like the idea of destroying the West and only icons associated with the West. But as far as the concept of, say, slavery, well, we'll give everybody else a pass. So the example of that would be Mecca. And they're chatting about Mecca was a big slaving center for a long time. So when people were going on the Hajj, on the pilgrimage, one of the ways you could finance it is to take some slaves with you, sell them en route. That would help you with accommodation and various other things. So there's a very strong, basically, slaving, basically, history and tradition with that. So if you were interested, these people who are getting angry about slavery, if they really were, they'd be just as angry, and if not more so, on that. But the fact they don't means they're not really interested in slavery. No. They don't really give a damn about people. They're more interested in the West. And it's just a talking point that they can talk about specifically with the West.
For power.
And because we're more... we've had a far more self-reflection and acknowledgement of what the wrongs we did. That's basically taken as an acknowledgement that we're the only one who did wrongs. But just the fact that other cultures don't talk about it like we do doesn't necessarily mean they didn't do it. Slavery was legal, I believe, in the Ottoman Empire up to the 19th century. It was only then they took Slavs off the books for slaving. So at the same time, basically, black African slaves were basically emancipated in America. Basically, Slavic or white European slaves were emancipated in Turkey. And no real kind of mention of that whatsoever.
Yeah.
There's a few other ones with slavery. I mean, coming to the UK to give context, and unfortunately now, if you've got somebody who's young in the UK and they're going to school, they will be indoctrinated from a young age, and they'll be very specific and with very, very good reason that for them it will involve 1650-ish till about 1830, and it will only be the transatlantic slave trade with black Africans to North America. That's the level of... that's the extent of our children will learn about slavery, because it fills a political purpose to basically destroy and go against the West. But if you wanted your child to understand of slavery, you basically go back to day dot. So in the UK, I mean, this is coming back to what I've been looking at recently, but I've kind of read broadly relatively for a while, and there's little snippets I've heard over the years which chatted about slavery, which I was aware of in England and the UK for a long time before, for example, the transatlantic slave trade. So, for example, I read a book maybe 15 years ago called The Tribes of Britain. And he mentions, I think it was Miles, he mentions it was pre-Roman times. There was archaeology on this, but there'd been some evidence that we'd been trading slaves for wine and other goods from like mainland Europe. So, for example, we had a taste for alcohol, and I guess slavery was prevalent in our society to the extent that it was used as currency for some of these items, some more desirable items. So there was definitely slavery before the Romans arrived. The Romans arrived, they started slaving. They took quite a few slaves, they'd send them off to Europe, across basically the Roman Empire. And I guess, who were they slaving? Gauls, Germans, Britons... I mean, basically various people like Thracians, like all these people, Europeans, they're basically slaving. And then we come to the end of the Roman Empire. Slavery was kind of took off again in the UK around about 837 when the Vikings turned up on the scene. So I think Lindisfarne was categorized as the beginning of this like Viking incursions into Europe. But they kind of invaded. There was Bristol was developed as a slaving city, a slaving town. And so this is going for the 10th, 11th century. They were transported to Dublin, I think Wexford, was it Limerick, one of the other ones? But basically Dublin was the big slaving hub. And it was from that it would be taken to Scandinavia. And that's if they were going to be used internally within Europe themselves. And then from Scandinavia, they'd be shipped down the Volga. And you take them to Byzantium, where you could trade them to the Muslim world. And there was a big demand for white women. It was more women, to be honest, sex slaves, basically, in the Muslim world. So it was, again, there was an international slave market and slave industry going from Britain. And so you've got the Viking slaving. And then you've got, so that formally kind of started to end in about the 11th century. Then you've got a rise of more serfdom. And so it's a different form of slavery. And then we've got a big, at least, spike coming through from the North African slavers, to the extent that it actually changed the demographics of Europe to an extent. But as recently as 1610, it was mentioned in the UK, what was his name, the government minister, that we had to pay bribes to the North Africans to stop slaving off the coast of England and Britain. And to the point that Spain, apparently, and he goes, the coastline was depopulated. There was so much, or so many kind of like North African slave ships coming in on the coastal areas that the people just abandoned the coast. And I think in the end, it was the North Americans. They actually kind of stopped it. They sent like part of their fleet or what came about before the American Navy to try and get some of these back. But the point was we did a deal with the North Africans to stop slaving on our coastline. And when the Americans got the independence in 1776, their basically deal, they were no longer liable.
Part of the deal, yeah.
So basically now the North Africans started going after the Americans again. And I think the American U.S. Marine Corps song has got something, to Tripoli. That's literally, they went to rescue Americans who were taken to slavery. Then we come into Cervantes. Basically the guy who wrote Don Quixote. He was 5 years a slave. He was a galley slave taken by the North Africans, but he was fortunate that he was taken, he had basically a rich family who could buy his freedom. And he goes, but then Thomas Sowell has got like a few points on it. He was chatting about slavery in various parts of the world. He was chatting about slavery in North America, comparing that to slavery to the Caribbean, slavery in South America, and then kind of Europe. And there's different characteristics and points of it throughout history. And but the point he was making, depending on how you look at it, what was going on in North America was in the scale of what slavery is historically wasn't that bad. I mean, they were allowed to have children, a family, and reproduce, whereas most slaves throughout history never got that opportunity. In some cases, you were chained up, and then you were chained up until the day you died. As in a seat, for example, I mentioned to you the galley slave. So galley slaves were taken, you were chained, you put on a bench, and then when you died, that's when you got taken off the chain. You didn't get any time to like go for a walk on ship because you can't let hundreds of guys go walking. So in some cases, you could spend 10, 15 years on a bench. You'd be naked because there wasn't a toilet. So you'd basically just shit and defecate on yourself and those around you. And he goes, that's your life. So you're on a bench, you sleep where you are, you live where you are, you die when you are. And if the ship sinks, you go down with the ship. And he goes, but apparently the smell, this is apparently the Venetian ones, you could smell a ship with slaves on it, or slave galley, miles away. It just this shit and
filth. So they were rowing?
Yeah, it was just they were rowing.
Before sail, so with sail, these are sailboats as well?
No, it's in the Mediterranean, there's less wind, so galley was like the best means of transportation.
Oh, okay.
So
how big a ship we talking?
Depending on the size, so depending on how many sets of oars you've got, could be 100 men, the bigger ones could be 300-400 men.
And you'd have one deck below where all those slaves would be.
Yeah, all the slaves are, and they're there till the day they died.
So what, you'd get taken, so life of a slave, you'd be living somewhere, in wherever.
So somewhere in Europe, so southern Spain, a boat turns up on the coast, or you might not have been aware it's there, and then you get a big group of dudes, with basically weapons capturing you, then you're off.
And then you put on a boat, lower decks, chained up, with your oar there, and it's like 5 men operating an oar.
Naked, kind of basically, then you shit and piss in your own filth until the day you die, and then the day you die, you're thrown overboard. And then they get another slave in. But the life outcome, so you die.
Imagine getting, here's your seat. There's a guy here before.
That's pretty much it. As far as kind of a slavery, that would be, any kind of form of losing your freedom is just horrible. There's nothing worse. But I think the Battle of Lepanto, 1571, basically the West won, and they freed immediately after the battle 10,000 Christian slaves who were galley slaves, just on that little one instance. And
galley slave, bloody hell!
So again, that was
kind of like the worst version.
My point of saying is, for a large part of history, Europe was kind of under the cosh, and we were targets of it, but it's not like they're just. Will blur that a bit. The people who are educating our children now, who are running our media now, will specifically go out their way to basically make a point of saying it only existed between 1600 and 1830 odd when we did it. That's what slavery is, and that's what best defines your civilization. And he goes, it only works if you don't talk about Viking slavery, if you don't talk about North African slavery. And he goes, the slave trade itself in Africa, you've got. There's various of the tribes. So in East Africa and North Africa, well, it's more East Africa where this going on. You had 2-3 tribes who were at war each other, and then they were slavering themselves. and then they go to the slave markets, and then trade slaves for but basically with the Europeans. And he goes, so it's not Europeans going and landing hunting parties. There's an existing slave trade in this area. The local elites who are from that liberty culture and liberty ethnic background are trading them. And it's no surprise that the last place where slavery still existed was Mauritania. And I think they only banned that in 1980. And he goes, where's Mauritania? East Africa. So in the same place, this industry was going on, 200-300 years ago, it's still going on today. And it was going on the times before to Roman times and pre-Roman times. It's so ingrained in their kind of culture. I mean, you could argue it's a human issue, this of slavery. But again, it's when you ignore that and basically refuse to give anybody context, and then you specifically go after one group and say, no, this is only 150 years and it's only this group doing it, you radicalize people to the point that they start going nuts. And this is what I'm seeing in these protests in America, that these liberal, basically upper middle class white people, they're nuts. Because this is the reality of the history. They've been told that, no, we really are the best because I've only ever seen it. This is only white people. This is our problem. And it's only their problem because whoever taught them only told them one truth. And I'm at the point now where I don't think it's just ignorance that they've only been taught one truth. There's a reason. And they're actually deliberately they're trying to incite hatred and racial violence.